The sky over Los Angeles was clear that afternoon, but inside the parked car on some random street, everything was fog. Jim Carrey, just over 20 years old, sat in the driver's seat of his old Toyota. Alone, exhausted, and broken, financially and emotionally. His parents had lost everything. The family was living in extreme hardship. For a time, they even lived together in a van. To many, that would have been the end of the road. But for Jim, it was the beginning of a promise. He pulled out a piece of paper, a check. He wrote the name, Jim Carrey, and with a trembling hand, he filled in the amount, $10 million. In the memo line, he scribbled, for acting services rendered. The date, 1995, 5 years into the future. Folding the paper carefully, he placed it in the glove compartment as if sealing a pact with destiny. It was a gesture of faith, not madness. A silent commitment to something no one else could see. He believed the universe would answer, but only if he didn't give up. That night, he slept in the back seat, cradled by distant horns and the hum of his own heartbeat, restless, insistent, hopeful. 5 years later, lights, red carpet, interviews, laughter. In 1994, Jim Carrey starred in 3 major box office hits: Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber. His name was everywhere. He was the new king of comedy. The whole world had finally taken notice. And then, as if the universe had accepted the deal, Jim received a $10 million paycheck for Dumb and Dumber. He opened the glove compartment. The check was still there, yellowed with time, but intact. The day everything changed. Just months after achieving his dream, his father, Percy Carrey, passed away. The man who had encouraged him to be funny since childhood, who had believed in his talent even during the darkest times, was gone, never fully witnessing the height of Jim's success. At the funeral, Jim stood silently, eyes filled with tears, but holding them back. No jokes, no masks, just silence. He knelt beside the casket and, in a quiet gesture, placed the symbolic check in his father's hands. It was his way of saying, "We did it, Dad. This was for you." In that moment, something inside him broke, or perhaps something deeper awakened. Jim began to understand that success didn't equal peace, that external accomplishments couldn't heal internal wounds. The boy who once dreamed of making the world laugh now asked himself, "Who's going to make me laugh?" Life had given him what he asked for, but loss had revealed what he truly needed. And though he didn't know it yet, Jim Carrey would never be the same again. The world saw a rising comedian, a master of mimicry and improvisation, a man capable of making entire crowds burst into laughter with just one crooked glance. But inside Jim Carrey, a heavy silence had begun to echo. After the massive success of Dumb and Dumber and The Mask, more films followed, more million-dollar contracts, more interviews. Fame seemed endless. Hollywood wanted him as the new face of comedy. And he delivered. But each smile on set became a little harder. Each round of applause felt more distant. Behind the scenes, Jim began to ask himself, "Why do I still feel so empty?" The cost of being funny. Being funny had become a duty, a burden. He wasn't allowed to have a bad day, to fail, to simply be human. On set, everything seemed light, but his mind was a battlefield. He constantly had to switch on the persona, the hilarious, electric, unpredictable Jim Carrey. But when the lights went out, the actor stepped off stage, and only the man remained. Jim began pulling away from people. His relationships suffered, his mental health fluctuated. At times, he wouldn't leave the house for days. The pressure was silent, but constant, the unspoken demand to be a source of joy for everyone else. While inside him, a nameless darkness kept growing. The real mask. In 1998, he starred in The Truman Show, a film that, ironically, reflected exactly how he felt. In the story, Truman is a man unknowingly living in a fake world, constantly filmed. When he starts to suspect the truth, his reality collapses. Jim's performance was praised as deep and moving. But what few realized was that he wasn't just acting. He was screaming on the inside. "I was living like Truman. I felt like the world around me was a spectacle, and I was the main clown." But who was I when the cameras weren't rolling? Even I didn't know. Jim said years later in a rare interview. The beginning of the fall. He tried to escape comedy by taking on more dramatic roles, like in the majestic and eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. And while his performances were acclaimed, something was still missing. The fame, the money, the applause, nothing seemed to reach past the shell that had formed around his soul. It was during this time that Jim began to speak openly about depression. Depression isn't sadness. It's your body saying, "I'm done. I don't want to play this character you've created anymore." That thought became a mantra. He realized his identity had dissolved into the mask of the artist the world knew. Jim wanted to stop. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to find that boy from the glove compartment again. The one who dreamed of $10 million, not the man who received it and still felt alone. The world laughs, but he cries. In public, people still expected the frenetic Jim. On the streets, they asked for jokes. At events, they wanted smiles. And he, as always, delivered. But inside, his own smiles were already broken. And he began to accept a painful truth. The man who made the world laugh no longer knew how to laugh at himself. Comedy no longer saved him. It was time to dive into the pain, to stop running. And that's when life, once again, came knocking at his door, in a brutal and unexpected way. It was September 2015 when the news spread through the tabloids like lightning, and with the coldness of a blade. Cathriona White, 30 years old, Jim Carrey's ex-girlfriend, had taken her own life. Her final hours were quiet. A goodbye written in shaky letters, left next to empty pill bottles. In the note, among words of pain and confusion, there was one name, Jim. The world reacted with scandal, the media with urgency, and Jim with silence. Complicated love. Jim Carrey met Catriona in 2012. She was a quiet, sensitive Irish makeup artist, with a melancholic smile and eyes that seemed to carry stories no one could quite read. He, the world-famous comedian. She, an artist trying to find her place in a world that often felt too big. Their relationship was intense and unstable. Breakups, reconciliations, private and public exchanges. The kind of romance that felt like two people constantly trying to find a safe place in each other, and failing. Even after officially separating in 2015, they remained in contact. In many ways, Jim was still part of her life, and she of his. The impact. Catriona's death hit Jim Carrey like a sudden avalanche. He wasn't just grieving, he was being pulled into the center of a tragedy that now involved him both publicly and personally. The funeral took place in Ireland. Jim insisted on carrying the casket, his shoulders hunched, his face pale and expressionless. He didn't speak to the press. No interviews. Only silent tears. A silence the world heard as a scream. But the pain didn't stop there. Not long after, Catriona's family filed a lawsuit against Jim Carrey, accusing him of providing her with prescription drugs and exposing her to a toxic relationship. Intimate details surfaced. Letters. Messages. Heavy allegations. Jim was called everything: guilty, manipulative, negligent. The media did what it always does, turned the tragedy into a spectacle. But Carrey, once again, didn't fight back with interviews or appearances. He responded the only way he knew how, by disappearing. A dive into the void. In the years that followed, Jim Carrey practically vanished from the industry. He turned down films, skipped award shows, avoided television. Now and then, a rare appearance shocked everyone. Long beard, distant gaze, philosophical words, as if he were speaking from another realm, another layer of existence. I realized we are not who we think we are. Not our name, not our profession, not our fame. All of that is noise. His words came like whispers from someone who had been dangerously close to the edge, and chose to return with only what mattered most. Many said Jim had gone mad. But he wasn't crazy. He was waking up. The inner trial. Even after the lawsuit was dismissed, the judge ruling in Jim's favor, calling the accusations inconsistent. The emotional damage was already done. It wasn't the external courtroom that judged him most harshly. It was himself. Carrey began studying philosophy, spirituality, and art obsessively. He painted protest pieces, made self-portraits, wrote cryptic phrases across the walls of his private studios. He said he no longer cared about the self, that the ego was an illusion, that in order to move forward, he had to destroy the character the world loved. And behind those mystical phrases was still a wounded man. A man who had lost someone, and who perhaps would never truly know if he could have saved her. The letter of forgiveness. In a rare 2017 interview, Jim Carrey said something that moved many. Grief is just love with no place to go. I still love. And sometimes, love just has to sit in silence and let the tears do their job. Sources close to him revealed that Jim wrote a personal letter to Catriona's family, not to defend himself, but to ask for forgiveness. Not for any specific action, but for any pain he may have caused, even unintentionally. He said he wished he had more time, that he'd said more, or maybe that he'd stayed silent in moments when words had done harm. The kind of confession only time can draw out, transformed by loss. Catriona's death didn't just wound him, it changed him. It was through that grief that Jim began to permanently let go of the comedian persona. He no longer wanted to make the world laugh. Now, he wanted to make it think. He wanted people to understand that pain doesn't care about status. That even those who seem to have everything may be falling apart inside. From grief to awareness, Catriona was never forgotten. In many of his paintings, Jim includes delicate feminine features. In interviews, he speaks of love as something that transcends life. Perhaps she was, for him, the breaking point between who he was and who he was becoming. That loss pushed him away from the screens and deep into himself. And it was there, between silence, sorrow, and self-reflection, that Jim Carrey began to rebuild himself. Not as an actor, not as a star, but as a human being. The spotlight was still on, but Jim Carrey was no longer there. The world's most famous comedian had disappeared. Not from the records, but from the persona he had carried for decades. The laughter stopped, film offers were declined. The red carpets were left behind, along with forced smiles, rushed autographs, and the obligation to look good. Jim stepped into silence. A deep silence. Frightening to some. Liberating for him. The man behind the mask. After the tragedy with Catriona, Jim stopped chasing what he once called life. He already had fame, money, recognition, yet everything had crumbled. He began living reclusively. Moved to a house in the Malibu mountains. Far from the city. Far from the noise. Far from expectations. There, time seemed to slow down. Jim spent hours in his studio, surrounded by brushes, canvases, vibrant paints, and instrumental music. He started painting compulsively. Not calm or conventional paintings, but intense, emotional portraits that almost screamed. Distorted political figures. Representations of ego. Eyes crying colors. That was where his pain became art. Painting lets me exist outside of Jim Carrey. It's a place where the ego doesn't rule. He documented part of this process in a short documentary called I Needed Color. Millions watched. He was no longer an actor trying to entertain. He was a man trying to understand. The new perspective. During this time of retreat, Jim turned to spirituality. He read masters like Eckhart Tolle, studied Buddhism, dove into the philosophy of the now. His interviews became different, almost unsettling. At the New York Fashion Week red carpet in 2017, for example, when approached by a reporter, he said, "There is no I. There's no Jim Carrey. This is all an illusion." The journalist smiled nervously, unsure what to make of it. But he was serious. Jim was no longer a character trying to appear normal. He had dismantled his own public identity and begun exploring what lay beyond the ego. Rejecting fame. While some called him enlightened, others accused him of being unhinged. But Jim didn't care. For the first time, he didn't need to be understood. He declined roles that many actors would kill for. He chose art, silence, introspection. In one interview, asked what he would do if he lost everything, he answered, "You can only lose what you believe is yours. But nothing is ours. Neither the body nor the name. We are consciousness. The rest is distraction. That philosophy began to guide everything in his life. Art as healing. His paintings became exhibitions. His videos went viral. Not as jokes, but as reflections. He said every stroke he put on a canvas was a conversation with himself. That painting was prayer. That silence was a new kind of scream. Jim also started writing, producing short videos with his narrations about love, pain, beauty, and impermanence. People began to see him as a new kind of artist. No longer the funny guy, but the profound one. A rare kind of celebrity who didn't want attention, but truth. The ego deconstructed. Throughout this process, Jim spoke more and more about dismantling the ego. He said the Jim Carrey character had been useful, but was also a prison. For years, I played a character the world loved. But I wasn't that guy. I was just a shell. When I realized that, I began to set myself free. This philosophy pulled him away from Hollywood, but closer to himself. And the most surprising thing? The further he stepped back from the spotlight, the more people felt touched by him. Not as fans, but as mirrors. Ordinary people, also tired of the performance. Also searching for a way out. Reappearing different. In 2020, after years away, Jim Carrey accepted the role of Dr. Robotnik in Sonic. Many saw this as a comeback. But for him, it was just an experiment. I played a villain like someone playing dress-up. But that's not who I am. I returned to the screen, not to the illusion. And then he disappeared again. Every appearance now was a conscious choice, not an industry demand. The voice of silence. Jim began giving short but powerful interviews. He spoke about mental health, the culture of appearance, overstimulation, and the importance of silence. His face was different now, calm eyes, graying beard, composed posture. A man who once was crowds, and now seemed comfortable being no one. Awakening is not peace, it's clarity. Jim Carrey's awakening didn't come in lights or applause. It came in loss, pain, and silence. He didn't become happily ever after. He just stopped running, stopped pretending, and because of that, he finally started living with some kind of truth. But one piece was still missing. After so much pain, solitude, and rebuilding, Jim Carrey still needed to find a new purpose. And that's where the final chapter of this journey begins. The meeting of a man with freedom and the ultimate acceptance of himself. The world watched the spectacle of Jim Carrey for decades. The brilliant comedian, the most expressive face of humor, the master of exaggerated expressions and insane voices. But over the years, that brilliant persona gradually faded like smoke in the wind. And now, facing a new dawn, there was a different Jim, not a comeback to fame or stardom, but a true renewal of the soul. Rebuilding himself. After the deep silence and intense pain that led him to deconstruct his own identity, Jim Carrey decided he no longer wanted to live for others. He no longer wanted to be an image projected on screens, magazines, or social media. He began investing in what he called the silent truth. Life away from cameras, applause, and spotlights. It wasn't an escape, but a conscious choice. He started dedicating his time to personal artistic projects, combining painting, writing, and activism. His works gained increasing attention for their raw honesty, and his speeches on authenticity and mental health resonated with millions around the world. The rediscovery of love and compassion. Jim also opened himself to deeper, more genuine relationships. He understood that love is not a show, and that true connection requires vulnerability, something he learned to cultivate even after so many losses. He was seen being more present among family and close friends, valuing shared silence and unmasked conversations. The philosophy of a free man. Reflecting on his journey, Jim said in several interviews that real freedom isn't about what you have or achieve, but about who you decide to be when the lights go out. I died to Jim Carrey the comedian. Now, I live as Jim Carrey the human being. And that, to me, is the greatest success. His message became an invitation for others to question their own masks and allow themselves to live with more authenticity and courage. A new purpose. At the height of this transformation, Jim got involved in social and environmental projects, using his voice for causes beyond the entertainment industry. He became a silent activist, an engaged artist, a mentor to young artists seeking meaning in their careers. The stage of life was now different, less glamorous, perhaps, but infinitely more truthful. The legacy of Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey was never the same, and that was the best thing that could happen. He left behind the character he himself created, embraced his vulnerabilities, faced his shadows, and was reborn as a more conscious, wiser, and more human man. To the world, he's not just the comedian from The Mask or Dumb and Dumber. He is the living example that pain can be a gateway to transformation, that fame can be a mirror showing us what we need to let go, and that, in the end, the greatest act of courage is simply being yourself.